Okay.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on July 10, 2022. It's a very small group today. So I haven't seen you for a while. Thank you for joining us. I know we all are dealing more or less with heat. So hope so far you had a great summer. And maybe we start with you, Greg. Do you want to tell us what have you been up to?
Well, I've been trying mostly to write. I've been writing a lot on Ukraine. My latest piece really asks the question whether the war in Ukraine will have a major effect on the emerging international politics. I would have said before the war that we were moving toward two clubs or teams, one around China, one around the United States. They wouldn't be nearly as bounded teams as during the Cold War. There'd be much more shifting of sides, more hedging of bets, and the two teams are pretty economically interconnected, very different from the Cold War as well. So that was the kind of order I imagined emerging. And the question I asked myself in my latest piece is, how might the war in Ukraine affect that view? I can think of three possible ways. None of them, well, the first two don't seem to me particularly likely, but they're the ones that people are thinking about. One is, will this really produce a tighter, more cohesive group of democracies? And there I'm skeptical, I think, partly because the coalition now is mostly very close allies of the United States and mostly in Europe. Many of the countries like India, like South Africa, like Israel have really sat on the fence. And so my imagining, and we all know that the strains in the coalition itself, particularly over oil and gas, are considerable and likely to get worse as people get tired of the war or as it gets colder in Europe. So I'm skeptical that this is going to, it certainly has given NATO a new life with Finland and Sweden joining, something I never would have expected. But it seems to me it won't produce this kind of global club of democracies. Second possibility would be the opposite. Will this create a sort of tighter club of autocracies, and particularly a tighter Sino-Russian alliance? I don't think either of those are likely either, because most of the would-be autocrats like Orban, he's also an ethno-nationalist, so he can't like seeing sovereignty trampled on by anybody. Ditto for China. I think this is pretty embarrassing for China to have their friend violate, you've heard me say this before, violate all the things that the Communist Party has stood for in China for 50 years. That's got to be hard to watch. And I think also there won't be a closer, too tight a Sino-Russian alliance, because Russia would be the junior partner, and that doesn't seem any part of Putin's imagining. So I think that other possibility is not especially likely either. And that, I suppose, leaves then the third big thing to think about, and that is, what does this mean for Russia? Might this really be the end of Russia as a major power? There again, probably not likely, but certainly possible. Anyway, those are my latest musings on the Ukraine, Pari and Puran. I'd be interested in your reactions.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. I also have been writing on Ukraine, but I'm looking at it from a technology point of view.
Right.
And I think Ukraine request, which was right few days after the invasion of the global internet community, showed a major gap in internet governance and posed serious questions there, that how it should be handled in future. So I'm looking at that, and one of the areas, again, like you, Greg, I'm looking at is that what we call digital deciders. Right. And these are various countries that so far within digital realm haven't made a major decision or alliances. And now, and in fact, outside digital realm also, they didn't make decision, but now specifically within digital, they're forced to make alliances because these fundamental technologies are coming along, and they have select one. So they're forced to make their decision, finally align. Now, what that alignment would mean, does it mean, is it going to cut deep and go to various other aspects, or is it going to be specific? So again, a letter was sent by a group of internet governance thought leaders, emphasizing the areas that they thought or recommended for sanctions and areas that they thought it shouldn't be touched. And looking at those, it seems that it's feasible and advisable that rather than having a complete alignment, it seems digital realm allows for flexibility so they can collaborate and align in one issue where they don't need necessarily to align in another issue. So that kind of flexibility, I think, is very helpful, also makes it far more complex and difficult to come up with some solutions. But I think that's starting to become more clear and better understood. But still, there's, I think, Ukraine war pointed out to a gap and a lot of questions that we are beginning to understand and try to figure out those questions.
Interesting, really interesting.
Any comment from you, Farhan, in any of these two?
Well, this is very sort of obvious drivers. And as Greg said, two possibilities. One, democracies coming together and trying to offer some kind of resistance to autocratic regimes, such as China and Russia. It's very clear that neither Russians will accept Chinese as a big brother, nor will Chinese accept Russians as big brother.
Right.
And Chinese are very gleefully looking at what happens to Russia, because Russia in the Western eyes has always been a power in decline after former USSR disintegrated. And Chinese have been trying to sort of take advantage of where Russians make mistake, go down the drain, and then China will emerge as a big brother and find Russia as an outpost in Europe. And that will really open the fault lines directly between China and Europe. So on the one hand, this is what is likely to sort of happen as we go along. But Russia has been a declining power, but Chinese are emerging and they're trying to pose threat both militarily and economically. And none of these two partners will ever want to see any one of these two as big brothers to anybody. So decline of Russia through Ukrainian war will go in favor of Chinese, and they will find Russia as an outpost in Europe. And that will really expose the fault line directly between Chinese and Europeans. And Europeans have been taking a little back seat when it comes to the China policy. So I think, it will be no longer in the medium and the long term between Russians and Europeans. It will eventually play out as an end game between China and Europe. This is what I think is really going to play out going forward. And democracies will really need to come together, Greg, at some point in time. Because if democracies like India or those in Africa and elsewhere, if they do not really rally together, the possibility would be that they could be clambered down by Chinese anytime. because they have been trying to play their game in a very, very notorious way, and in a more notorious way after Russians go down with regard to the power due to the war that they are waging in Ukraine. I think democracies willingly, unwillingly, will need to really come together, whether tomorrow or the day after, because otherwise it would be pretty difficult. Why are they not really coming together? Because they find it pretty hard to trust in US. Because they think if they come and put their everything in one single basket, there's no guarantee that the US will stand by them tomorrow. So it is out of fear, it is out of lack of trust, and it is also out of energy, cheap energy, which they might be feeling in the short term will be coming to them, supplied by Russians. So I think eventually democracies will need to really take a call and come together, because democracies could only try and restrain these autocrats in ways that they can't really go beyond a certain point in time. So this is what I feel going to play out in medium and long term. Short term could be anything, but medium to long term is the democracies will really need to think and come together. Willy-nilly, willingly or unwillingly, in the larger interest of their own safety and security and rule-based global order.
And Puna, that's fascinating. Do you think, what happens if the current kind of uncertainty, continued uncertainty, polarization, gridlock in the United States continues? Can you imagine still a coming together of the democracies without the US being a major leader?
US will need to be there, Greg, because we could disagree with the US, we could like them, we may not like them, but no country anywhere on the face of the earth could do anything big or better without taking Americans on the side. So America's relevance will continue to exist unless and until America and Chinese, they go back to 2005 and try to work on G2. Because if you really recall, Greg, there was a talk of G2 starting in 2005, I believe. And it was Fred, and the person was trying to think through it. And the whole idea was that Chinese and Americans will divide the whole world into East and West. West will be taken care of by US, the rest by Chinese, and on the larger global problems, the two will come together and try and sort everything out. And see to it that they do not also allow any country on the face of the earth to do anything whereby Cold War could come back to haunt these people. Unless and until that game is not played by Chinese and Americans, and this is what democracies fear, and that is why they're not really throwing all their stuff into one basket. So G2 is a kind of a worry and a fear in the minds of a couple of countries around the world, especially Africa, some part in Asia, that this would not happen, that Americans and Chinese come together and divide the whole world to their taste, and everybody else then has to go either this way or that way. So that is the kind of a thing which will really need to be played out pretty clearly. The second one is that the US will also need to consider, Greg, that Asia is going to be the biggest market for Americans.
Absolutely.
China is roughly about $14 trillion in next 10 years. India will be roughly about $12 trillion. $26 trillion worth of market in about a decade period from now will be from Asia. And I'm not really taking any other country, but if you really take other Asian, emerging economies, it might really end up at about $30-35 trillion. And US will really need to consider that any trade or commerce will grow more meaningfully if there is a safety and security for trade and commerce to grow. And therefore, while US is putting all its energy in Ukraine and NATO and Europe and putting a lot of forces and all of that therein, they will really need to think through as to what they really need to do with regard to Asia, Indo-Pacific, and see to it that that part is taken care of so that trade and commerce can flourish, where US will also have a lot to gain. So Asia will really need to be taken care of pretty well by the US administration in a more obvious way, not dilly-dallying, not here and there, but giving trust and confidence to emerging economies in Asia that, look, US is around and nobody will be able to really fiddle with the order, global order, both in trade and commerce, which will also secure safety, security, and sovereign integrity of the land, which many of the countries in Asia hold. Because Chinese, everybody fears them because they are, not good people. They can do anything, anytime. So how do we really stop them? And this can happen only through diplomacy, through force, through communication, and giving them no option that, look, you can't really cross the red line. And if you do it, then there would be very serious consequences for you. This is what I think.
Yeah. And I think, Greg, in response to what you said, America may have some internal problems, but when it comes to foreign policy, somehow they stand by, they're united. They may be very disunited inside, but in foreign policy, they are united. They always have been, and I think they will remain united. I don't see huge differences between various, sort of administrations. I mean, look at Biden going to Saudi Arabia after everything he said during campaign, so at the end, they do what needs to be, what is regarded as best and interest of the country when it comes to foreign policy, and they will be united on that, I do believe. What do you think, Greg?
No, I
You
worry.
believe administration?
We can, think about Trump. I mean, Trump was completely uninterested in foreign policy, uninterested in allies, thought they were a burden, not a help. And we could go right back there, it seems to me. Now, I think if we had Trumpism without Trump, they might at least, Hawley or Cruz even might at least be interested in governing in a way that Trump was plainly mentally unfit to do. But still, and I suppose in those circumstances, you might say put on that most countries have no alternative but to look to the United States, whether they really like to or not.
Yeah.
And maybe that does get something of what you're talking about, Patty, that it's certainly true that in details, Biden has done lots of things that were necessary, like going to Saudi Arabia, that he hadn't talked about doing. So.
And I think Trump is an exception, really. He was an exception. Otherwise, if we remove him and we think about other administration, they more or less, when it came to foreign policy, there was a lot of similarities. With Trump, I accept what you mentioned because that was an exception, totally different. Now I want to switch to something else. Greg, what do you think about this few days ago, the assassination that took place? How do you see that is going to play out in global politics?
I think it's, it's a very sad thing for Japan.
For everybody.
For everybody, for sure. My guess is it probably won't have much global effect. Now we know that gun violence is exceedingly rare in Japan, so that isn't going to change. In some sense, that assassination underscored how rare gun violence is in Japan, is certainly by comparison to us. Their gun violence rate is 200 times less than the United States. It's an enormous difference. So my guess is there'll be some grieving and some soul searching, but it certainly isn't going to change Japan's policy toward guns. That'll continue. Whether it revives a bit the kind of nationalism that Abe reflected, a willingness to arm more, to relax some of the constraints of the Constitution. Whether that debate livens up in the aftermath of his killing, don't know. That would be the one, I think, the one area that to look at where there might be some movement in Japan's external policy.
Puran, any comment from you?
I agree with you, Greg. And after assassination of Abe, police in Japan has accepted the fault of how could that person who sought Abe down, sought him dead, how could he really reach so close to him? So one thing is really going to happen is that it is not really going to remain the way it was. So there'll be tightening of safety and security for political figures and those who are important. The second thing which might really happen is, as Greg rightly said, rise of nationalism, because what he said was not really liked by some, but was liked by many. So there could be a revisit to the pacifist constitution which the Japanese had in post-World War II scenario. And the third one is that there will be a rethink about China, because he was the one who was trying to take that kind of hawkish position on China, with his brother being the Minister of Defense in the current government. And he was also trying to sort of take that hawkish position against Chinese. So that part is really going to play out. But what I have seen, Pari and Greg, is that democracies have suffered. I mean, in 1936, 2 Japanese prime ministers were shot dead in a day, if we go back to the history. In India, we lost a couple of prime ministers. So has
Sorry, Puran, your voice got cut off. Could you repeat it? Just the last part you said. 2 Japanese
prime ministers were shot dead in a day in 1936.
Okay.
Democracies like India, we have lost a couple of prime ministers who were shot dead by those who did not agree with them or their policies. The same has happened in the US. Democracies become more resilient when they pass through such difficult times. So I think the same is likely to happen in case of Japan. But normally the tendency in democracies is that whenever such a hard thing happens, then people learn, they become hardened, they take the lesson and move it on. So I think Japanese are really going to take that lesson and move on in a much better way than what they had been earlier on. So I think democracies have this tendency to become more resilient when they pass through difficult times or adversity in the national life. So I think the same is really going to play out in case of Japan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
That sounds right to me too.
I agree. So, is there anything, Greg, you want to discuss?
No, I don't think so. Hope everybody has a good week, and that
Yes.
the heat stays away. Puran.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you so much indeed.
And also, I think next week again, I'm traveling, and maybe we will just send a text for next meeting. Probably it won't be next week, week after or week after that, depends on what is happening. And right now we have paused a bit. We're not taking new interns, so we are trying to pass the summer before we start again full-fledged meeting and everything. So anyway, please watch for my email to see what we are doing. Definitely next week there won't be a meeting, but I'm available if there's anything to discuss. And meanwhile, I wish you a wonderful week ahead. Take care, stay out of heat, have fun, and yes, see you next time. Take care, bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Greg.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Well, hello.
Hello.
Please stop recording.
Oh, yes, that's right. I'll do that.